The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour.
And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him.
Some think that the Gospel according to Luke has the shortest crucifixion.
It was about the 6th hour, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he gave up the ghost.
Matthew and Mark clearly have Jesus surviving a little longer.
And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out.
The disciples wanted to take Jesus' body down from the cross immediately, but the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was doubtful.
And Pilate marveled if he were already dead.
Pilate was reassured by the centurion that Jesus was dead. But this was the same centurion who had earlier said,
"Truly, this man was the Son of God."
Jesus' body was then laid in a tomb donated by a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. This Joseph and a man called Nicodemus came to minister to the body.
They came to Jesus by night and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight.
These accounts, when viewed as an historical rather than a sacred record, may raise many questions. Why did Jesus die so quickly? Why did Joseph and Nicodemus take so many herbs into the tomb? But no one really doubts that Jesus was crucified. Even in Jerusalem, where the crucifixion happened, and where one is forced to remember that we do not live on a Christian planet, one is also reminded that Christians, Jews and Muslims all accept that Jesus was a man who lived and died in 1st century Palestine. What really separates the Christians from everyone else is their belief in the gospel story that Jesus rose from the dead. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built upon what was supposed to be the tomb in which Jesus was laid after the crucifixion. This, according to devout Christians, is the exact site of the resurrection. And if anything can be described as the cornerstone of the Christian faith, it is the resurrection of Jesus.
If you take away the resurrection, what you're saying is that Jesus was a Messiah who said some really interesting things, and some things that we might all want to copy, and then he died. And so, therefore, he has no greater significance than that.
I think any ancient historian has to look very hard at the question, why did Christianity begin and why did it take the shape it did? And when you're trying to look at why that happened, all the early Christians for whom we have evidence say, well, it happened because of who Jesus was, but particularly because he was raised from the dead.
The resurrection of Jesus, as far as all the Christian churches are concerned, is absolutely fundamental to the faith. There's no question, in my mind, that it's ever going to be changed.
But while the resurrection may be fundamental to the faith, the gospel accounts of it, unlike those of the crucifixion, are full of inconsistencies and curious contradictions.
When we read the resurrection narratives, it's like reading 4 different reports of the same football game in 4 rather different newspapers. And the fact that actually there may be some disagreement about whether it was a foul or not doesn't mean that there wasn't a game and that somebody didn't win it and so on. If one of them says there were 2 angels and another one says there was 1 angel, if one of them says Mary Magdalene was there all by herself and somebody else says Mary Magdalene was there with 1 or 2 other women, then these are the sorts of variations that you expect to get, like the different newspaper reports, the football match. And they're not something that should worry you to the point of saying, therefore nothing happened. That would be quite a false conclusion.
But the Gospels do not just disagree about the number of angels or how many women arrived at the tomb. When it comes to the resurrection, the Gospels literally lose the plot. In the earliest versions of the earliest Gospel, Mark, there are no resurrection appearances at all. The Gospel simply ends with the discovery of an empty tomb. The last verses of Mark, which do contain resurrection stories, were added 200 years later. Matthew and Luke do have resurrection appearances, but they don't agree about the details. In Matthew, Jesus meets the women near the tomb and then meets his disciples just one time, and that is on a mountain in Galilee. In Luke, Jesus meets two unnamed disciples who do not recognize him, and then meets with the remaining disciples before leaving them in a village just outside Jerusalem. The last Gospel, John, has many different stories that do not appear in any of the other Gospels. Having all these differing Gospel versions of the story is confusing.
None of the Gospel stories is CNN in Jerusalem in the year 30.
These aren't people who are standing at the foot of the crucifix with notebooks in their hand, writing it all down.
The Gospels are written in the form of historical biography, so many people have assumed that they are exactly that. But that's not actually what they are. They're written to demonstrate to people the importance and the meaning of Jesus and his teaching. That was what they're for, and they do that very well. But they're not primarily interested in what actually happened back there.
So one is forced into the apparently blasphemous position of doubting the historical truth of the Gospels.
If you start saying it's blasphemous to question gospel truth, which particular bits of the gospel are you choosing to say that about? Or are you saying all of them? And if you say it's all of them, there are endless bits that contradict each other. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John tell different accounts. I mean, some of them don't even tell about Christ being born in a stable. You know, which bits are true and which bits aren't true? If you look at the Easter narrative, the key narrative of the different Gospels, they all tell different accounts. Some of them don't mention the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, what is gospel truth? There are 4 Gospels. They all tell different truths. Surely people have to realise that it's much more complicated than that.
These complications have led many modern scholars to suggest that the Gospel stories were not written to tell of a miraculous event, but that they were written with an entirely different and political motive.
Whether we like it or not, the function of the stories in the last chapters of the Gospel is not to establish Jesus has risen. Isn't that marvelous? Which surely would be enough to say. But Jesus has risen, of course. But to whom did Jesus speak? And whom did Jesus put in charge?
Insisting that Jesus literally rose from the grave and was seen by a few people who knew him after he died is a way of restricting the experience of resurrection to a very few people, and therefore maintaining the authority of the group within that group.
You have competing leadership accounts using apparitions or empty tombs to establish who's in charge here or who's in charge there. That's their function, that's their purpose.
So Peter is said to be the first witness of the resurrection. To this day, of course, for example, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church claims to be the descendant of St. Peter, and authorized, by an unbroken chain of ordination from Peter. That is, the resurrection is taken to be validation in many cases of the authority of the churches.